So if you look at this picture right here, this shows you the three major areas of the integumentary system that we were talking about. And where my finger is, and right in it, right here, it might look like this, my finger is touching the area of the dermis here. It might look like I'm adjacent to the hypodermis, right here. But in reality, functional reality here, and the correct answer here, this is part of the epidermis. The epidermis has this long invasion into the dermis, and that long invasion into the dermis is part of one of the accessory structures of our integumentary system. So there's three main integumentary system accessory structures. There's hair, nails, and glands.
Wait, that section where the brown stuff is, that's also part of the epidermis?
So where this part is
Yeah.
part of the epidermis.
Okay.
The superficial part, this part is part of the dermis. Okay, so I would put the pointer right here. Where is this in the structure of the epidermis? This is part of which is part of this is part of the integumentary system. This is really part of the epidermis. Okay, so where my pointer is right here, right? So this part right here this is basically, if you follow this, I'm going to tell you in a minute here. This dermal papillae. We talked about the dermal papillae. This dermal papillae right here is right there, that indentation. This is a major indentation right here. And then if you look over here, there's a gland, and that gland is another accessory structure. And of the glands, the accessory structures that are most important, the glands are the one that I'll spend most time talking about. In terms of the hair itself, some of us have lots of hair on our head, as someone just pointed out to me. Others have less hair. Gianna wasn't the one who did that. In addition, I had someone tell me that they saw a video of me. They're like, oh man. So there's a student who's here from, I think she graduated in 2014. Anyway, so she saw a video of me and she's like, wow, he got old. So the color of your hair changes as you age. The amount of hair changes as you age. And for some of us, it gets gray and we lose it a lot. I won't tell you who that is. So depending on where you are in the body, right, you may have hair in the body, you may not, but there are definitely areas of the body that you don't have hair. In particular, distal segments of fingers and toes. Where are distal segments of fingers and toes? Why am I bringing that up right now? Because again, that terminology, anatomical terminology, is really important. Again, I'm trying to stress remembering that. Quiz 2. All of that terminology is going to come back to bite us if you don't know that. In terms of the hair itself, the hair follicle, a major part of it, I don't spend a lot of time talking about it. The one thing I will say is that the hair projects into the oops. Hold on a second. I did not mean to do this. Oh. Good, how are you? Perfect. My wife is at home and she also has AAA, so I will text her that information. All right? All right. Yes. Middle driver's side. Yes. Yes, it's annoying.
Do you not see this? What?
Okay, but I think I just want the structural part. I'll be able to ignore it if it's less.
Brain kids.
Yeah.
So are we cooking? Are we cooking? Are we cooking?
I don't think so.
Okay. 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 All right, great. Thank you very much. All right. So I had a problem with my, I'm getting my windshield repaired with my car, and my wife is home. And I thought they were gonna call her because,
Did you take your wife's car?
yeah,
Come here today?
I talked, so we're getting our Bentley fixed, so I'm driving the Jaguar.
Bentley?
Yeah, so I'm driving a Jaguar.
Are you? I think.
I can't bear until Friday.
So just so we're clear, I said that my Bentley was getting repaired and I'm driving the Jaguar. So that was, I apologize for taking that. I don't like taking calls during class, and I don't do that routinely.
I'm getting surgery.
Right now?
No.
There's a million things I could ask you, but I won't. All right, so what is the major protein that is a part of the hair? Keratin. All right, so keratin is the major protein. It's the major thing that is responsible for preventing hair loss, and it's the major protein that also causes cells to die as they move from the stratum basale superficially. So that is a thing that is important. The base of the hair follicle right here, we have these, sort of the base of it. This contains the stratum basale, which is what I said a little while ago, and that's really what we're going to worry about, right? So the base of the hair is the stratum basale. So now, if you think about this, for those of you who have hair, right, and it grows, right, the stratum basale is going to be the one that has high mitotic activity and high protein synthesis. The cells that are making protein are also going to be making keratin. You just told me that, right? So it makes sense that the cells that are part of the stratum basale are also going to be making, instead of new cells, in this case, these ones are making more keratin, and it's part of the hair, right? So that's where we're talking about. So in addition, it also supplies, the adjacent cells will supply a new source of epidermis, and we've talked about that. Here's a terrible thing to talk about. Male pattern baldness. I don't know if anyone has that in this room. Although I can tell you that my cousin, who is a little younger than me, so now back in the old days, we didn't have a lot of drinking ages and stuff like that. He was, I want to say 15, and he had less hair than I have right now. Right? I'm not 15, right? He was bald, and he was going to bars when he was 16, because who's bald at 16, right? He had very, very little hair, and by the time he was in college, he had like a little ring of hair right here, and once again, he makes me look like I have a lot of hair. So I should have him come visit me. He doesn't have alopecia, but there was we do have a former personal work colleague that I work with. I wish she was here still. She's awesome. She used to run the school. She would like take kids, like smacking them and saying, not literally, right? Verbally, like taking them and making sure they did their stuff and stuff. But she was awesome. But she had alopecia too. So if you look at this, it's an autoimmune response. What does auto mean? Auto means that is your body, your immune system, attacking something. And in this case, it's attacking keratin production. So it's affecting the amount of hair that was produced by the body. I remember having a URI professor when I was in undergraduate had that as well. So hair growth is based on the production of keratin. It's based on the, there can be new hair produced once in a while, speaking from experience, not much. In addition, hair color can be modified as well and changed. One of the things that hair color is modified by is melanin, which makes sense, because we talked about it being in the, and melanin is produced by melanocytes, which is part of the epidermis. All right, so that's what, regardless of what the previous slides say here, we're talking about those parts of the keratin producing cells affecting the color here is affected by the melanin. Now, one part that is absolutely in the dermis here are erector pili muscles. These erector pili muscles are attached to the base of the shaft of the follicle, of the hair follicle, on one portion, and then on the other portion they're at the stratum basale, or at the most superficial portion of the papillary muscle, of the papillary dermis. The erector pili muscle then will extend down there, attaches, and then when it contracts, all muscles do is shorten, so that if there's 2 points there and they shorten, what happens is it pulls the hair up, and in the process of pulling the hair up, it pulls the skin down, and it produces this thing called goosebumps. If you're scared, if you're cold, you have goosebumps, and that causes the hair to stand on end. That goosebump here is simply is an autonomic movement of the hair follicle. In other words, it's not a conscious movement of the hair follicle. Look here, this erector, and I hate the way this drawing is done, because here is one end of the attachment of the erector pili muscle. If they extended this picture several centimeters to the right, they could have the other attachment to the erector pili muscle, and then you could see physically how it would be pulling down on the base of the epidermis and the base of the stratum basale, which is right here. The stratum, it's pulling down on the stratum basale, and in the process pulling up on the hair. Now, let's talk about another accessory structure. So that's that's the first one. The second one is glands. These are exocrine glands, not endocrine glands. The exocrine glands come in a number of different categories here. In particular, there's sebaceous and sweat glands. Of those sweat glands here, there's a number of different categories, and there's eccrine and apocrine are the 2 major categories, and in 2 modified versions of them. The ceremonous gland is a modified eccrine, and a mammary gland is a modified apocrine gland. So let's talk about what these are and what they do and what they're not. Okay. So not all glands are producing the same stuff. Not all glands are located in the same areas, and not all glands have the same function. So we're not worried as much about the structure of the glands, of the exocrine glands. I'm not going to worry about whether it's simple or complex. I'm not going to worry about whether it's unicellular or multicellular. Right? We're not necessarily worried about that, but we are worried about the location and the secretion substance here. So the holocrine gland here, the sebaceous gland is holocrine. It is, if it's holocrine, that is something we talked about from the previous lectures. It produces, when it secretes its material, it causes a cell to die. That sebum, or sebaceous, is an oily substance here. It inhibits drying, it inhibits bacteria from developing, and it is in areas associated with the hair, generally. So at the base of the hair. So a sebaceous gland is basically an oil gland. Sudoriferous glands come in 2 major varieties here. They're eccrine and apocrine glands. The eccrine and apocrine glands are not the same. Okay. So first of all, the eccrine gland is most common. The eccrine gland, I said that I'm not as worried here, but these are simple coiled tubular glands. That's something I probably won't ask about. but I definitely will ask about it opening directly onto the skin. It's going to be mostly containing water, and as a result of it mostly containing water, it's going to be an important role in body temperature regulation. So if eccrine glands are sweat glands, these are two different types of sweat glands here. If eccrine glands rather are these are most common and they're involved in temperature regulation, what else is there? There's signaling. There's secretion of materials here. These apicrine glands, they secrete organic compounds here. Those organic compounds are not necessarily smelly, but they do, when they attract bacteria, they become odoriferous. In other words, the smell that is associated with the individual is not produced by the individual, but produced by superficial bacteria that are breaking down that material. So as they break down that material, the bacteria then release those compounds, and then that's characteristic smell. I can tell you here, well, one thing here, before I tell you about my son here, the apicrine glands here do not help regulate temperature. So the main difference here, one produces these organic compounds that are not water-based, that do not help body temperature regulation, and that one is the one that's characteristic associated with smells. So when my son was around 12 or 13, he was playing on a soccer team, and I would pick him up every day after practice, and so my Bentley had an automatic trunk control, right? So I would just pop that trunk. I was like, every once in a while, he'd put his bag and everything in his, except for him, he'd put everything in the back seat. I go, dude, put it in the trunk, buddy. I'm like, why, Dad? I was like, the trunk's open. Can you just do that? I didn't want to embarrass him. I was like, finally, he's like, Dad, why do you make me always put it in the trunk? Mom doesn't. Well, Mom's got a van. Well, so we also have a van, right? So we have a Bentley, we have a Jaguar, and then we have a van. Mom has a van, right? That she. Well, why do you make me put it in the trunk? Do you really want to know? It's like, man, it stinks, man. It was just horrible. What was happening there? He was going through puberty, and all of those organic compounds are getting broken down by bacteria. Oh my God, it was smelly. And so where are they located here? Largely in the axilla region here. Where is the axilla region? The armpits. There's also in the genitalia, in particular the scrotum generally, and the labia, and also around the anus. So there's lots of areas where what is this going to be doing here? Evolutionarily, you're going to start signaling to other members of the species that you're ready to reproduce, right? So that's what's happening. So the apicrine gland secretions does something very, very different than the eccrine gland secretions. And by the way, the eccrine gland is also a type of merocrine gland, right? And that's something we talked about in chapter 4. Modified sweat glands include cereminous and mammary glands. Cereminous is also known as earwax. That combination of that earwax is a different material in there, and it's basically trying to keep stuff from getting into the ear. And then modified apicrine gland is a mammary gland that is produce milk, right? And that's something in particular after birth. The final accessory structure in nails, and I'm not going to ask a lot about the structure of the nails, so that if you look at the nail body or the hyponicumum, the matrix and the nail bed and the nail root, right? So these things are analogous to the production of hair. Okay, they're the same thing. What's the difference here is basically the amino acids in the cells. Right? You get one group of amino acids, you make hair. You get another group of amino acids, you make nails. And then if you get another group of amino acids, you make really, really hard nails, and then you could be a predator, right? So we don't have really, really hard nails. But if you think of like jaguars or lions and things like that, right, they have the same structures here. They're exactly the same. If any of you have dogs or cats, right? So our dog, who is my favorite child in the family, my kids are 2 and 3, and I always say to them they're tied for last place, because my dog is definitely number 1. But she had her dew claw. So dogs have 5 fingers just like we do, but they walk on their fingers like this. Their fingers are really, really long, and we'll see pictures of them in a minute. Not a minute, in a couple weeks. their fingers are really, really long, so they walk like that, and then they have a dew claw. And if any of you know what a dew claw is, it's sort of up on the ankle, right by the wrist, right? And so the dog, you know, they wave their paws right up by them. There's this dew claw, and that's their thumb nail. And there's not a lot of friction there. There's not a lot of abrasion, and so that nail can grow into a circle. And if it gets into the circle, it will grow back into the dog's leg. So then you got to clip it. Right? That's what's happening here. It's hard keratin, and it's slightly different, but it's the same process as hair keratin. Okay, so keratin is keratin is keratin. It's produced by keratinocytes, and those keratinocytes are producing it through exocytosis to the adjacent cells that are going to ingest it, and that keratin then is going to cause those cells to die. And if it's attached if the protein is different, then it's going to produce hair. If it's one way, it's going to produce the structure of the skin, superficial skin, and if it's another way, it's going to produce nails. Hair growth and nail growth is the same thing, really. So now we've talked about the structure of the skin, the accessory structures of the skin. Let's talk about two examples of the physiology. First thing is temperature control. And so temperature control is something you're pretty familiar with. And then we're going to talk about production of vitamin D. So if we talk about temperature control, one of the major structures that now we've built that is associated with temperature control is hair. So hair on the head, hair on the body can be an insulator. It can if it's an insulator, it can keep the body from getting warm, and it can prevent the body from getting cold. Both those things happen here. In addition, specialized hairs, so for instance, eyebrows and eyelashes can keep sweat out and other particles out of your eyes. There's also hairs in your ears that will keep material from getting into your ears, and it will also protect things, right? So these things will act as a barrier in general, but in addition here, we're also going to be protecting against UV radiation. So we have hair on the head here. Another thing that we're going to be doing, and I mentioned this already, but I haven't used this term, desquamatation. What do you think that means?
Peeling skin.
If you're D, you're losing it. And what does squamous means? Well, those are the flattened cells. So you're getting rid of those flattened cells. As a process of getting rid of those flattened cells, you're losing stuff that is associated with that could be potentially invading your body. So these microorganisms and other foreign substances can be invading the body. So all of these things are happening here. So not only are we talking about maintaining body temperature or losing body temperature or getting that negative feedback there, but there are other parts of it. I'm not going to really worry about sensation associated with the skin because we get deeply into that, a whole chapter on that later on this semester. The process of cooling is called evaporative cooling, and we've talked about negative feedback already in chapter 1. So there's evaporative cooling, and I mentioned it already when I was making that speech in Spanish. Right? That's a process of releasing heat, and then there's the process of retaining heat, and you need to know both mechanisms and you need to know the consequences of both. Here's a picture of someone that is releasing heat here. These are arteries. These red things are arteries, and don't worry about the suffixes here, whether it's an artery or an arteriole. Yeah, so if you look right here, this thing right here, if you look at that term right there, these are arteries, right? They carry blood away from the heart, and that's good enough. And some of them have these little valves on them, and they can either dilate or constrict. If they dilate, they let more blood there, and if they constrict, they let less blood. So in this case, they dilate. So on the top view, they dilate, and there's more blood going to the surface. As more blood goes to the surface, the amount of heat goes into the surface is increased. As more blood's going or more heat's going to the surface, evaporative cooling occurs. There's more perspiration associated with what accessory structures here, those sweat glands, and that gets increased production, and then the person starts perspiring. As that perspiring occurs here, the heat loss increases and body temperature decreases. The converse also happens. If the person, and there's two things that happens here. The first thing and most immediate here is constriction of the blood vessels. As you constrict the blood vessels, you don't stop blood going on, but you reduce the amount. As a result of reducing the amount, if you stop blood from going here, then all this area of tissue would die. I want to talk about that in 1 second. But I want to retain heat in this body. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to constrict blood flow. So I'm going to have a little bit of blood flow here so that I'm feeding these cells, but we're trying to maintain as much heat as we can. So what's the next thing that's going to happen in our body if we're trying to maintain heat? What's the next thing that's going to happen in our body if I'm trying to maintain heat? What am I going to do? Which tissue does that? Cardiac muscle?
Skeletal?
Smooth muscle? Or skeletal muscle?
Skeletal muscle.
Skeletal muscle, is that a voluntary response or an autonomic response or an involuntary response? So it could be voluntary if you wanted to, right? But it's generally an involuntary response. What happens, now, let's carry, so now I'm turning the heat way down. Joe Harlan's already cold, so I'm turning the heat down. I'm freezing her ass out, right? So I'm gonna make her so cold, right? So now, she's already getting the heat, she's already losing blood flow to the skin, and she's still cold. So now she starts shivering, now she's still cold. If this continues for hours and hours and hours, what's gonna happen, or for a long time, what's gonna happen to these cells right here? You're gonna reduce the amount of blood flow, ultimately these cells are gonna die. What's that gonna be called? It could be frostbite, right? So, and it might be hypothermia, so it depends on how bad it gets, right? So that's the next step in this progression, right? And that's really a function of that's when you're talking about negative feedback where you're getting too low. So if this body temperature drops too far below, then you start these characteristic responses to try to generate heat, and ultimately that can be life-threatening.
Dr. Clancy,
Yes.
when we are sweating and we're getting too hot, and let's say it causes the temperature, like let's say you get a fever now, would the blood flow, would it just keep getting larger and larger, like, or does
So-
it speed up?
There's a limit to how large the vessels can get. If they get too big, then that's a problem, right? Because then they stop functioning.
Yeah.
When you're talking about things like infections and stuff like that, one of the characteristics about infections here is that if you've ever been where you spike a fever and then your fever goes down, and then you spike your fever and your fever goes down, that's typically in response to the infection sort of releasing into the blood, and then we're responding to it. Our fevers, in that case, is trying to kill those bacteria or those viruses. So there's that, right? But we also have limits to the amount of fever that we can produce, because if we go over, say, about 104, 105, 106, right, that's sort of bad for our body, right? We sort of kill ourselves. So we don't want to do that, but we also want to get rid of the virus. So that's a problem, right? So we have other mechanisms to kill that. But these blood cells right here, these blood vessels right here, have a limit. They can't increase too dramatically, because if they do, they'll break the cells themselves. Just can't do that. Okay. All right. So that talks about temperature control and that negative feedback. And if there's any other questions about negative feedback here, then you need to go back to chapter 1. You need to go back to sort of the terminology that I used with chapter 1. There's the control center, there's sensors, and there's effectors, right? And you should know what those things are and how they respond in the context of temperature control or in the context of vitamin D production. So vitamin D production, right? Vitamin D is important, and it is an another word for vitamin D. It's called calcitriol. So calcitriol is a hormone that there's a number of different places where it can get produced, and it can be produced by the skin or by the intestines, and where in the intestines from your diet. So you can take medication, so pills and things like that for vitamin D. You can also get it through other products in your digestive system in your diet. And then also, what's the problem with getting a lot of vitamin D in the coming months? Say January and February, right?
It's not gonna
The
be
sun
sunny.
is going to be, we're already observing it, right? I get up every morning at 6 o'clock, and now it's hard to get up, right? And it's dark out. It's like, man, I don't want to go to school. I don't want to do this lecture, right? It's getting dark out. So the vitamin D production from the sun is a problem. So there's a couple of things here. So what does vitamin D do? First of all, we'll talk more about this later on in the next chapter here. Calcium and phosphate. So PO4 2- here is phosphate. That's the chemistry of the P with, when I drew it, when I was talking about let's see, ADP plus PI is ATP. When I do this P right here, that's that. Okay, I don't can write that. Phosphate, right, is from the intestines here. Well, it can, there's a number of different productions of it. We're going to talk about that tomorrow more. Calcium in the blood is important. You need a certain amount of calcium in the blood for normal muscle function. If there's too much calcium in the blood, then you need to put it somewhere. Where do you put it? You put it in your bones. If you want to get it out of your bones and you need more calcium in the blood or for your muscle control, then you take it from the bones. Right? So that negative feedback here. So what we're talking about here is we want a reliable amount of calcium found in the blood so that there's not too much and there's not too little. If there's too much, we put it in the bones. If there's too little, we take it out of the bones. The bones are a huge source of calcium. So this part right here, calcium levels, you need to control calcium levels. How do you get rid of calcium? We can get rid of it out of the bones, and you can also lose it during urination, right here. There's a couple of, couple of chemicals that are associated with calcitriol or vitamin D, and that help with this aid in absorption of the skin, of calcium. So we're going to talk about what those in a second here. So let's talk about calcitriol synthesis, vitamin D synthesis. Vitamin D is the thing that is controlling this whole thing, this whole story. And we're going to explore this story further tomorrow. First of all, if the epidermis gets hit with UV light, that UV light then encounters a number of things, one of which will count cholesterol. What type of macromolecule is cholesterol? It's a lipid. It's a modified lipid, and I showed you some pictures of that in the first exam. So that lipid then can be modified. That lipid then is modified in this 7-dehydrocholesterol molecule, and that can be stored in the skin. Right? As that temporary molecule gets stored in the skin, it will be modified into cholecalciferol. So this molecule right here, cholecalciferol, is the one that gets put into the blood. So we're going to start with two things. We're going to start with cholesterol and UV light. I don't worry about the intermediary form here, this 7-dehydrocholesterol. So cholesterol and UV light makes cholecalciferol. That cholecalciferol is transported to the liver and the kidneys, and there's definitely a difference right here. There's sort of a characteristic here, but I'm mushing them together. The liver and kidneys here, and first it goes to the liver, and then it goes to the kidneys. I'm not worried about that. But the cholecalciferol is this intermediary step. It gets transported to the liver and kidneys, and then it makes calcitriol. That calcitriol then is vitamin D. Okay, so there's the intermediary step, the cholecalciferol, that then transported to the liver and kidneys, and then you make the final version of it. So How do we start modifying this, and how do we use negative feedback? Once again, this calcitriol is worried about, we're using this to maintain calcium, calcium concentrations in the blood. Let me see here. Wait a minute here. I thought I had a better. I thought I had a different picture of this. All right. So, for right now, it must be in the next chapter. It's in the next thing. I'm jumping ahead here. So, when light hits the skin, UV light encounters cholesterol. That cholesterol converts to an intermediary molecule. That intermediary molecule is then converted into cholecalciferol. That cholecalciferol is transported to the liver and to the kidneys, which is then converted into calcitriol. That calcitriol is vitamin D. For right now, when you have low amounts of calcium in the blood, you try to take this calcitriol and increase the amount of calcium in the blood. And there's two sources: the diet, the digestive system, or the bones. Calcitriol will take calcium from both sources, and it also will prevent urination from us from losing calcium in the urine. So we lose less calcium in the urine, we take calcium from the bone, and we also take calcium from the diet. When calcium gets too high, we start getting rid of calcium here. Calcitriol is responsible for that. We shunt it into the bones, we shunt it into the back, into the urinary system, and then we lose it that way. And so it increases too much, decreases. When it decreases too much, then we have to increase this, and that's negative feedback. It's controlled by this vitamin D production. Do you have a question?
I was gonna say, so like, let's say you are like calcium deficient, and you see now like the production of vitamin D is using a lot of calcium, either from the bones or.
So if you're wait a minute, did you say calcium deficient?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, yeah. So, let's say you receive vitamin D, and now your body's trying to use. No, cholesterol. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Will the body always have like enough cholesterol, or could?
So when we try to lower our cholesterol amounts, when someone typically wants to take lower cholesterol lowering drugs here,
Yeah.
we're not talking about having zero amounts of cholesterol, right? There's a ton of cholesterol in our body, right? Someone who has to lower cholesterol here will have way, way, way too much cholesterol, right? So now we're getting it down into healthy levels, right? What you're talking about is having an absence of cholesterol, and if we had an absence of cholesterol, then our body would make new cholesterol. And again, it's through negative feedback. There's too little cholesterol, our body would build it up, and so it would be impossible for us to have, for a normal healthy person, it would be impossible for us to have too little cholesterol. Okay? If we talk about amount of lack of calcium in our body, the problem with that is that the bones will start to break. So we'll talk about bones structure tomorrow, and the structure of the bones, they require calcium to be physically strong, right? And then that's a problem. That's a medical problem, right? And then you need that, right? So if you're a normal healthy adult, you have enough calcium in your body. Now you could have slightly too little or slightly too much, and then we talk about calcitriol adjusting that, right, through negative feedback. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about normal, healthy control of calcium. Okay? All right. So there's a lot of details here. We're going to end the lecture right now. Who just left? Oh, let's just everyone sneak out, and then when she comes back, no one tell her, right? When you guys leave here, so tomorrow we're going to talk about chapter 6. We're going to start talking about the structure of bones and getting all the details of this. On Wednesday, we're going to get back into calcium control. And I'm gonna adjust the schedule for the quiz, okay? All right, have a good day, everyone.